Hi everyone, thank you for staying for the Q&A. I'm Caitlin Boyle. I'm going to moderate our Q&A today, and I'll just have each one of you just introduce yourselves and your role on the film.
I'm Emily Packer. I am the director of Holding Back the Tide.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Phillips. I'm one of the editors for Holding Back the Tide. Oh, sorry.
Hey, I'm Ben Thompson, and I'm a producer on How to Fill the Unfillable Hole Inside of You.
Awesome. A round of applause for these guys. So I'll just start us off with a couple questions, and then I hope that you guys will chime in briefly. I don't know if these top lights can be turned down a tiny bit, but I cannot actually see anyone in the audience. So just start. Yes, that's a little better. Just start in if I'm pointing randomly to people. So, oh my gosh, there's so much to say. I love the pairing of these films together, and I thought maybe Ben, you could start just by telling us kind of the origins of the project. Where did the idea come from? Is it personal? I'm very curious about the recipes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes from the mind of our writer-director, Dave Canning, and the idea that your gut is the center of emotion, and when you see these people in these really emotional circumstances, they call back to the things from their past, and often that's food, and it brings us back to the things that comfort us and that get us through really hard times. And so that was the origin of the story that we come up with.
And how much direction did the actors get? Like how directorial was the team in terms of how they interpreted the recipes, and how much did it kind of come from their choices?
Yeah, great question. So it was a real collaboration. So it obviously started with the location and the general setting, and then Dave would give the actors a couple ideas of prompts of what he thinks would happen, and then they would just sort of go, and then they would, obviously drawing from things in their own personal lives, and then Dave would tweak that a little bit depending on what he wanted for the shot. But honestly, it was really cool to just see how these recipes just sort of blossomed out of the actors, and we got some really great things out of it.
Yeah, I love how the first one, you're kind of what's going on? And then you see the recipe and it's sort of lighthearted, but you also feel sort of torn. And then as it goes, that sort of juxtaposition of those feelings sort of builds through each one. I thought you guys did a beautiful job of that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the recipes, it's funny when you see it up there, and I think that's right. I think that's funny to be oh, sure.
Yeah. And Emily and Lindsay, I would love to hear, well, Emily, maybe you can just start by talking about the origins of your project and how you maybe envisioned it in the beginning and how it sort of progressed as you made the film.
Sure, yeah. Well, Lindsay and I actually met at a fellowship in Brooklyn where we were doing research towards transportation. That was sort of the prompt of the fellowship that we were doing. And I ended up making a film with another collaborator named Leslie Steele about a ferry that some community members wanted and some community members didn't, called By Way of Canarsie. And in doing research about this, I was sort of thinking about the city as a project, especially New York, as sort of a project that community members have to buy into in order to make it work, and what are we as a city sort of willing to invest in our futures in this sort of immediate versus the long term. It was also right at the time when a huge subway line that I was living on at the time was going to be shut down, and they ended up opting for a solution that's going to cost a lot of money and only last 30 years versus the original plan to last 80 years. And so I was thinking about how we in the present can imagine ourselves from the future, looking back. And when I learned about the oysters and was thinking about the subway and thinking about all of the effort, all of the resources that were literally being poured underneath the city and into the waters, also started thinking about the oysters as these very, very small, tiny creatures that one at a time is adding towards this larger problem or larger phenomenon. Oysters aren't adding to the problem, but it's sort of how do we as people, how do we hold on to this like larger goal of self-preservation in the face of climate change when the actual human steps to get there are often quite small as well? And so that was like the impetus sort of for the project, and I also just really wanted to work in community and with friends, and I think we set out to make a short film about just the city, just environmentalism, and we learned that the oysters change their sex as needed, and that was really exciting to us as like an entryway point for our perspective on it, as well as sort of an intersectional perspective that takes those historical, post-historical view a little bit. Anyway, so we shot the first real scene of the film March 10th, 2020. And then like 3 days later, there was nothing more to be done in terms of production for a while. And so we really dug into research. We really like held on to each other and the process as a thing to sort of get us through that period of time. And the longer we were able to do research, the more it sort of spiraled out of control into the thing that you see here before you today.
Yeah, I think the pandemic had an interesting way of like shifting the tides, no pun intended, of how projects that were begun like before the pandemic ended up evolving. And I think I kept thinking about the sort of just like geologic or like beyond human sort of span of time that you're exploring, that there's the human history of the last 100 years or 150 years, but then there's this sort of like much broader geologic span of time that the oysters are part of, and that the ecosystem of New York Harbor is part of, that you're sort of touching on without having to explicitly kind of explain that. And I like both films, I think, leave a lot unsaid and leave a lot for the audience to sort of like make their own connections around, which I really appreciated. I have so many more questions, but I want to open it up to the floor here. Does anyone have a question for either film team? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. It was a really good film. It's a question from both of us because we're a pack. Anyways, what we were wondering about the technicality of how the thinking process behind the film, and how you decided to put the visual poetry inside the documentary narrative itself. Like, do you thought about that from the start, or did it happen during your research, doing the structure for the documentary, and then you decided the visual poetry would be something great to be inserted in between? Or what was the thinking process behind that? Because we feel like it was really good, and I personally really like the end where it invokes with the waves, and then and the visual poetry in general is we see some symbolic things like in the end where the actors became oysters, like going into the sea, like holding hands, and and then we have a little bit of laugh in the end about people eating oysters, and it's a visual treat, and it invokes many emotions at once. So it was really beautiful. So what was the thinking process behind that to Emily and Lindsay? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aziz, for the question. I will start, and I think you probably have something to add about the visual poetry, definitely. But I think as we were doing our research, we tried to have this sense of city symphony where the characters and the people that are all touching this creature, that are all connected through this sort of map of the creature, there's some things that we could find in order to like overhear knowledge being passed to other people kind of in natural spaces that would elevate the characters to experts, getting knowledge where you might not expect it, like at the fish market. And then there were some things that we were really determined about in terms of our own perspective on the oyster that was born out of our research that we didn't think we could find or overhear as it was existing in the city right now. And so that was sort of that opened us up to the possibility of doing more with scripted work. And so the things that we felt like we couldn't do otherwise, that's when it became a creative question for us to see how do we interpret that, how do we exchange knowledge in this way, or put what our perspective is like not on top of the oyster, but sort of how do we create the situation that would lead to like those conclusions. So that was like the impetus for doing the actual poetry, I guess, and the sort of more poetic scenes. But the visual poetry, I think part of it is really to do with talking about the cinematography a lot with the three main people who were shooting with us, but then some of it was Lindsay in the edit room figuring out how to like take these ideas and make them feel meaningful. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, this film was so fun to cut together. I think like unlike a traditional documentary, there was just so much room for play and just like visual eye candy to like, it was just like really fun for us, like, you know, over the course of the editing process to like go back through and like, oh, like this shot can connect to here and it can make a stronger meaning in this way, or it can just like, even if it's not like a concept, it's just like emotionally taking you into a space. And so it was just like really fun to just like blend all these things together, to recycle and to recall things and to like kind of bring everything back together, you know, similar to the process, like, you know, of, you know, the oyster, just like bringing it all back around. And yeah, it was just like really fun to just like play with those concepts a lot.
I think one of the like last scenes that we edited maybe is actually like the end, which doesn't usually happen, but it really, I feel like we didn't have a strong plan for how we wanted to end the movie other than the hand holding, and so we sort of took that, like, I think this is probably mostly your writing in the montage of like what are we recalling, like what are we seeing in our like last moments with the film, the fish going past the subway, the people as oysters huddled together under the water. That was like writing that happened in the edit room.
Other questions?
I have a comment. I have never eaten an oyster in my entire life, and after seeing the film, I'm going to be brave and give it a shot.
Hi, thank you for both films. Question for Emily and Lindsay. Also, I'm very, very inspired with this film because I think that we don't see enough documentaries that are necessarily, what's the word? I don't want to use like non-traditional, but it's more that it doesn't follow one character necessarily. You know, I think characters is the oysters at this sense. I wanted to ask about the part of the subway falling in the water and all that sequence, and what is the thinking behind, how did it come to that point, and how do you connect subway as also a very important and almost like crucial part, especially in New York City, with the oysters and that entire sequence?
Yeah. I could talk about this for a long time, so please cut me off when I'm going too far. But I think, like what I was saying about how I came to it is just thinking about the city's resources. And one of the reasons why the subway line was being shut down to be redone was because of corroding of the subway system during Sandy, which at this point was over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And so the volatility of the water being both a gift and a nurturer, and also can be this like destructive force that is rising. That was really interesting to me. The sort of like saltiness, the like corrosion. and also to see an image that we're so familiar with as New Yorkers, being the subway dropped into the water like that, it almost kind of feels like your heart is is leaping a little bit because we associate them with people. So that footage was archival. It was like taken by a news organization when this retired subway cars were being repurposed as sort of a replacement for the oyster reefs. So there is an inherent connection to me because the reefs are gone, and so they were trying to do what the oysters were doing with man-made materials and repurposed materials. And we actually talked with the head chief of waste at the MTA from his basement on Zoom. It was very cute, and learned a lot about it. And actually the subway cars were being dumped in different zones that also had oysters in them and now don't. And so that's not actually taking place in the harbor, but the New York subway cars are being dropped off the coast of New Jersey and off of South Carolina. And so to me, it's just like very evocative, not just to think about the sea level rising for us humans and, you know, all of those wonderful depictions in the subway mosaics of the water creatures coming into our world and potentially thinking about our human world getting submerged, but also, you know, our influence on the bottom of the floor. Those are some things. Yeah.
For both of you guys, I was interested in how you chose the locations. Ben, for your project, each character is in a very different place, and some are like the bar scene for me just looks. I don't know where that was, but it just feels very like iconically New York, and the fountain scene as well, or the pool there. How did you guys choose the locations for each scene or each segment?
Yeah, so all of those are shot in Brooklyn. The first scene is actually off the Newtown Creek right there. And it's, you know, like anything sourcing locations in production, it's a conversation between like the director and what his creative vision is and trying to execute that in the best way possible. We were fortunate that we found some really great spots that really spoke and it kind of think sort of elevated the scenes themselves. But you know, we were looking for something that was like a good platform that then the actors could then leap off and do their recipes from.
And the scene with the child, I mean, he was great.
He's so good, right?
Incredible.
Yeah.
How did you find him?
We had to do a casting search, and we've worked with child actors before, and we've been very fortunate to find some really great child actors. But you know, just being in New York City, there's always people that are fantastic, and he was just a joy to work with, and you could see the joy that he had, you know, on screen. So yeah, it was really cool.
So natural and true to children that age. It was.
Yeah, he's wonderful. Yeah.
Awesome. And then for you guys, your locations. Tell me a little bit about that, like the shooting in the oyster bar, which is so iconic as a New York landmark, but also obviously as a symbol of like oysters. But then all the other, the scenes that you've shot on the shores and in the waterways and the waterfront. It's so, even when you know, like, New York is a series of islands and peninsulas, it's still kind of shocking to see how wild the coastlines are and how kind of removed they are from the built environment in some ways, even though they're right up against the built environment. And I'm wondering how you guys kind of chose, I guess in both, initial production, how you chose where to be, but then also in the editing, like how you chose to kind of juxtapose those images and set them up in a way that we kind of see the division between the natural world and the urban environment, and also the closeness between them.
Yeah, great question. It was very important to me that we include all 5 boroughs in the movie, which I was really glad we were able to do. And then we also do venture out a little bit in order to find those like indigenous mounds. That's actually in Hudson Valley, which is not that far from New York, but and then of course Long Island. So that's sort of like the map that we're building. And a lot of it was just where the work was happening, but the other main concept that was driving us is like, how do we get the environment to tell part of the story for us and not, ever interview someone in a place that feels stiff or feels like artificial. So one of the hardest decisions to make was like, where should we be when we're talking about the African American and Black history of oystering? And there's actually a much longer and in-depth sort of history in Sandy Ground, which is in the very southmost tip of Staten Island, which is actually where the what are they called? The breakwaters are in that other scene. And so we're standing like on top layers of history there. And so we brought Moody, the mother shucker, over towards that zone to talk about this, and had heard about this like iconic shipwreck that has been there for a long time, just sort of like trying to evoke this and trying to sort of bring him to a place where those the history of New York as a natural environment and as a built environment would just like naturally sort of be on his mind. Those were among the difficult decisions about where to film. Others, we shot with Billy and Oyster Project when they were planting things all over the place, and got to sort of choose like which of them really worked for us.
How did you choose the oyster farm?
The oyster farm, we chose to work with Sue because I talked with her on the phone and she had the best voice I've ever heard. But she also, we had been, one of my producers, one of the film's producers, Trey, and I had been doing pre-interviews with farmers that were all over Long Island, and I had talked with the farmer's market guy about where he got his oysters, and I was sort of getting to know different people. And part of that, like, how do we infuse our perspective on this was like, okay, can we cast someone, like documentary casting is what it's called, like can we cast someone who is representative of some of our ideas? And so we heard of a few, very few female-owned farms, and even fewer than that, queer female-owned farms. And they know each other, and we got connected. And Sue is actually a former WNBA player, so she's a little bit used to being on camera. And she was just totally the right fit for us. And she actually recently saw the film for the first time and watched it twice in a row and loved it. And she was actually a little bit hesitant to talk about her own like sex and gender ideologies on screen, but when talking about them through the oyster, it opened up a space for both of us to like feel comfortable with each other. And I really identify with her. I think her sort of like admittance of feeling like almost like non-binary womanness was like an interesting clash, and something that I feel like nearly spiritually connected to with her. So she's a special one. Do you have an answer to the place as edit question?
I'll just like very quickly say, like early in the process, we had talked about, do we need text cards to tell us where we are in the city? Like, do we need like a Manhattan text card? Do we need a Brooklyn text card, or like wherever we were at? And I think we really tried to make it work for a long time. And in the end, we just scrapped it because it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, it's all connected. We're all here. Like, and I think that, I think we just decided that it wasn't needed to like place us there. We were just, we were there.
Yeah, we also, I'm a little bit allergic to like too iconic of imagery. I wanted to be thinking about how we as New Yorkers are seeing the city and not how it's like postcard perfect. And also like redirecting attention away from just the urban and to see like what is this actual environment that we're in, which is so, we're often very disconnected from it in New York, partially because of Robert Moses and how the city was built, but how do we, how do we keep this in mind when like if you're in the jungle of buildings and never looking at the water, how do you plan for or anticipate like large scale like natural disasters and that sort of thing? So that was our focus.
Yeah. Is there one last question? Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about this wonderful character with their flowers and opening oysters and all these? It's almost like a silver lining or like a red thread that goes through from story to story in a very gentle and wonderful way, and almost like an imaginary friend. What's can you tell us more when it came up and
Yeah, that person's name is Hannah. They are actually a PhD candidate now in cultural anthropology, I think. But they were at the time a poet only. And they were a poet who had been working as an oyster shucker. They were one of the first people that I spoke to about this project because I was interested in the fact that they felt that they had an extra thumb muscle from doing that labor, like repetitively. I was thinking a lot about labor in the making of this project and what it does to like our bodies as well. And so they had been sort of like aware of my interest in this like 2 years before we were shooting it even. And that was the first thing that we really shot once we had sort of gotten our ideas clear enough. So that was the March 10th shoot. And if you can imagine, we were also like we were trying some different things. We were like, let's give some oysters out on the street. And everyone is kind of like, is COVID real? Like, do we? Anyway, but they were in town for one day. I got the day off of work. It was my birthday. We had been studying all these Dutch paintings of oysters and how those were like depicted through time, like in the Western world, and sort of like what it means in terms of like wealth and oysters. And so we sort of had this like kaleidoscopic idea of like, let's bring the oyster cart idea back to the streets with almost like that like painterly painting or picnic type idea. And we encouraged Hannah to sort of dress themselves, and they were really excited about the idea of having their tits out. So it was like a mesh top that I think works really well with all the different mesh that we see in the movie. Oh yeah, you did it. It was in there. So it was sort of this like layering of ideas that we could explore in the very places where there was like such historical significance, not only where oysters had been shucked on the street, but where the oyster meal was like creating the buildings and the streets that we were standing on. So it was, and it is kind of imaginary, like it has this ghost-like quality. So we had started for a while describing these scripted characters as ghosts that were like haunting from the past to sort of like be embodying something about that past in the present, and being able to cast mostly trans folks in that role was like amazing also, and they brought so much to it. And when Hannah throws the oysters into the water at the end, we had been joking about it, knowing through our research that is how they regenerate, is through the shells. But I think that that was their improv. They just like wanted to do it, and they did it, and it's so beautiful. It's also really important to me that they eat one as well as this like laborer that we've been seeing through time. And the secret is that they did not want to, and they spit it out right after that take. They were like, I've shucked too many, I don't want to do it.
Also, just really quickly, like that scene for a long, long time, it was just one scene. And then like along the way, like in our edit retreat, I think we're like, oh, let's break it up, like duh. And like we'll make it like these like 3 distinct chapters, and like have it be a thread that we kind of follow through, and have those scenes like help connect us to these other scenes that we're gonna launch into.
They end up being a guide, like a narrative guide in some ways. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all coming to a 9 o'clock screening.